Well, I am glad you're here today because I get the privilege of actually kicking off a brand new series today called March Madness, now that we're in March. And I know some of you sit here and you wait all year for March Madness. You can't wait to tune into the NCAA basketball tournament. And I'm about to disappoint you because the title of our series is actually tongue-in-cheek. We're not going to get to talk about college basketball during this month and all of the fun madness that comes with that. We're talking about a completely different kind of madness. And maybe you have noticed we live in a world filled with madness. It is a mad, mad world, and sometimes feels like it's getting madder every day. And if you look around and you're not sure what everybody's mad about, maybe you don't know what you're supposed to be mad about, just read the news, watch the news, check out culture for a moment and find a subject. Pick any one of them of your choosing. Talk about healthcare, or social issues, or gun control, or abortion, or immigration, or scandals. You could talk about war. There's threats of war. We've got bad drivers. And there's Taylor Swift. And on top of all of that, some of you may have noticed we're actually in another election year. People everywhere, right? They're feeling unsettled. There's a sense of angst. There's anxiety. There's certainly anger. People feel spun up about things. Some people just say, I'm fed up with everything. And we wake up in the morning, and this is the world that we wake up to. It's perpetual March Madness out there. And unfortunately, we can't hide from it. Like, we can't hide from the reality that this is the actual world that we live in. It is filled with turbulence. It is filled with uncertainty, and it is filled with unrest. And we've got to figure out a way to find our way amidst the chaos. And that is the goal of this series. That's what we're doing in this month of March. We're going to help better find our way and navigate through this madness that seems to always swirl around us. And I'll tell you right up front, there is a way. Like, we can find a better way. We can do it. We're not the first group of people to live in a difficult world. We won't be the last group of people to live in a very difficult world. And most importantly, we have not been abandoned in this pursuit to do it on our own. God is actually with us. Like, God has not abandoned us amidst all that we see in the chaos. God is with us here and now in today's day and age, and He can help us find more peace in the middle of the chaos that swirls in our lives. In fact, when the early church was just getting started, they were getting off the ground. They too had to deal with a very, very difficult culture. They had cultural upheaval. There was community division. They had their own types of political unrest. There was corruption back then as well. They had all the general challenges of everyday living. And in the middle of all of that culture, Paul, the Apostle Paul, one of the great writers of the New Testament, he reached out and he wrote a letter to the church that met in Rome. And Rome was a difficult place to be a Jesus follower, but he issued a very challenging directive to them, and it's still a challenging directive for us today. This is what Paul writes to the early church. He says, don't repay anyone evil for evil. And he says, be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And then he says this, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, we know that we can't always control the things that happen to us. We can't always control the things that happen around us, but we do have a choice to make about how we respond and how we participate in the things of our life. And Paul starts by saying, don't seek retaliation. In other words, don't instinctively respond with anger and contempt. In other words, don't get spun up right on the surface. Instead, do all that you can when it depends on you to live at peace with everybody. And herein lies the challenge. Like, this is a huge challenge. That means we have to give very careful thought to how we navigate this madness around us. We may want to find peace in the chaos for us, but more than that, we're actually called to be peace bringers. We're not called to just find peace. We're called to be people who bring peace to other people and actually lead to more peace within the environments that we're a part of. And so that is the challenge that Paul gives to us right up front, and it's the launch pad for us for these coming weeks. We're going to tackle this idea 4 parts, and today is part 1 of what does it look like to navigate the chaos of our lives. And today we're going to talk all about this issue of beliefs. Today is all about beliefs. We're going to talk about how we should handle them. And it's not going to surprise you at all when I tell you that one of the reasons we experience turmoil in the world is because people actually have different beliefs. And not only do people have different beliefs, they feel very strongly and very passionately about many of those things that they believe. And that's not unique to any one person or any one group. Like, that's an everybody thing. Listen, everybody has a belief system. You can be young or old, you can be rich or poor, you can be religious or non-religious. You all have an accumulation of beliefs. We all have a way in which we see and interact with the world around us. And so we live in a world where ideas and beliefs and practices collide all the time. You know it's true. You've got some of that in your own house. Some of you say, man, we can't even find agreement under my own roof. It's just you and your dog. It's natural. Anywhere you go, you're going to run into different beliefs, different ideas. Things collide. And here's the challenge. Conflicting beliefs, what does it do? It creates tension. That's where it comes from. This collision of beliefs, it creates tension, disagreements. Disagreements quickly cause tension, and you may experience that right now. You may have that at work right now. Maybe there's a difference of ideas or practices with someone at work, and you know it, and you're in disagreement with them, and there is tension with that person next to you. Some of you feel it with your neighbors. Some of you feel it with your own family members, with the people closest to you. Some of you feel it with your parents. Some of you parents, you're feeling it with your kids, right? It starts out as a simple disagreement, just a difference of beliefs, but that collision creates tension and ultimately can fracture very important relationships. We see this fracturing of relationships all around us. It's way too familiar. See, I always say we live in what I call an adversarial culture. Have you noticed that? Like, we live in this adversarial culture. We can create enemies very quickly. You're on one side or you're on the other. We're all adversaries, and it's far too common. And here's the sadness. That same idea, that same culture, it creeps into here. Like, it's in the church. We know that, right? Like, conflicting beliefs and practices happen when it comes to faith as well. Not everyone believes the same thing. Not everybody sees everything the same way. And so we see tension in the church, and that adversarial culture creeps up, and before long we fracture relationships with individuals and even entire groups of people in the Christian world. And all of those things are real, which is why we're going to kick off March Madness today by talking about this right here. We're going to talk about beliefs and how we manage that issue. And what I'm not going to do for the next 25 minutes is tell you what to believe. Like, today is me not telling you what to believe. We're actually going to talk about something else. I'm going to ask a bigger question, a higher level question, which is this: How should we approach issues of belief? Not always about what we think, it's about how we think. And today is all about how we think. How should we think about the things that we think about? That's the question for today. Because I think we need to carefully consider the things that we believe. I think we need to carefully consider the things that we do and know why we do them. And so we're going to jump in to answer this question. It begins right here. We have to recognize not all beliefs are created equal. Not everything that we believe and not everything we do is created equal. It doesn't all have the same weight. It doesn't all have the same significance. When it comes to the truth that we find in the pages of the Bible, God himself actually differentiates between levels of belief. God would tell us that there are some things when it comes to our Christian faith that are absolutely essential. There are beliefs and practices that are essential, but God himself would say there are actually some beliefs and some practices in our life that are non-essential. And for some of you, this might feel like a little bit of a different way to look at things. Maybe you were brought up in a certain church or maybe a certain tradition where there were only two categories that God would look at. Everything is either right or it's wrong. But today we're going to talk about the fact that God actually sees some things as essential and some things as non-essential. Listen, our faith, and I'm talking now truly about the Christian faith, it has essential beliefs. It has essential practices. And I'm going to refer to those as what I would call the core DNA of the faith. Core DNA. When you think about DNA, you know what that is, right? DNA is what gives genetic instructions in a sense. It builds the life form. If you don't have DNA, you actually don't have life. Or if something were to happen and the DNA gets mutated or something goes missing, then what was designed to be is no longer what it was designed to be. And so in order to build true Christianity, it does require some essential foundational DNA type things. Essential DNA. God would deem those things the most important. God would deem these things the most important for us. And honestly, these are the things he makes most clear for us when he lays out truth of the Scriptures. And essentials, those are those things we're willing to die for. Quite literally, there are people around the world that will die for these today. They will die for the essentials. In other words, they are the hills to die on. Those are some things that if you believe them or if you practice them, you may suffer ridicule for. You might get persecuted for. Sometimes you may even have to separate relationships over these kinds of things. Like, in other words, there are some things you have to stand separate on, and when it comes to these, you may not always be able to agree to disagree. And there are essential things when it comes to our faith. I'm going to give you an example of this. In the New Testament, again, the New Testament, Apostle Paul, he's dealing with the region of Galatia, and there's a Galatian church there. And look at what he writes. This is what he writes. He says, when Peter came to Antioch, Paul says, I opposed him to his face. And Peter is one of those disciples. He's one of the 12. He's the guy that denied Jesus 3 times. That Peter, right? And when Peter was there leading that church movement, Paul came to him and he said, I opposed him to his face, because he says they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. There was something there that was brushing up against what Paul would consider to be an essential. And let me tell you about this. It says they. In the early first century, like soon after the church started, there was a collision of 2 different people groups in the church. You had the Jewish followers and you had the Gentile followers. And maybe you know this about the Jewish followers, right? The Jews, they were steeped in Jewish tradition. They had a lot of rules, they had a lot of laws, they had beliefs, they had practices about what they could eat, what they could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. They were really hung up on the whole circumcision kind of thing. And the Jews would very closely connect all of those works and all of their behaviors tightly to their salvation. In other words, their rightness with God depended on their rules. And then you have these Gentiles, and the Gentiles are coming to the party, and they don't have that Jewish background. They're just showing up, and so they don't have that kind of issue. But this is where the problem happened, because the Jews looked at the Gentiles and said, hey, you need to add some rules, and you need to add some traditions to your salvation process. And that's where Paul said, no, to do that would be to actually mutate the core DNA of the gospel message of grace, of the work of Jesus and what he did. And Paul looked at Peter and said, you're not doing enough to stand up against this. And so Paul stepped in and reaffirmed. He defended a core essential. Look what Paul writes. Look what he says. He says a person is not justified by works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. And if you want to hear it again, he said, so we've put our faith in Christ, that we may be justified by faith in Christ, and what? Not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. He wants to make sure it's clear. It's clear. This right here is an essential. This is essential core DNA of the gospel. God makes it very clear for us, and it's very important. And to not believe it would actually mutate Christianity. So we have this right moment. There are times we've got to defend and identify essential beliefs. But as I say that, again, I remind you, not everything we believe, not everything we do is essential. Some of the things we believe and some of the things that we do day by day, they're actually non-essential beliefs and practices. These have to do with matters of what I'll call individual decision, and sometimes they're a matter of our own individual conscience for all of us in the room. Now, non-essential, it doesn't mean non-important. It doesn't mean non-important. It simply means non-essential things don't rise to this level of core DNA. In other words, it's not something that we have to die for. It is not a hill to die on, and is not something we need to break fellowship for. When it comes to non-essential things, we actually can sit down in a reasonable way and agree to disagree. And just as Paul gave us an example of what it looks like to defend an essential, Paul talks about how we should handle some non-essential things. He's writing again to the church in Rome, and he runs into this circumstance in Rome. Look what Paul writes. He says to the people in Rome, accept one whose faith is weak without quarreling over what Paul calls disputable matters. So he introduces this idea of disputable matters. He's talking about something that is non-essential. In other words, this is not something that God is going to make clear in his word. And not only that, it's not something that he makes uniform. It is not something that everyone in the faith would need to adhere to. And in this instance, he says there is a disputable matter, and it actually involves whether or not Jesus followers are supposed to eat a certain type of meat. And so I'm going to explain this in just a moment. But he says one person's faith allows them to eat anything. It includes meat, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetable. Here's what's happening in that day and age. This church in Rome, there's paganism around there, and paganism had idol worship. And as they practiced idol worship, they would often sacrifice different animals. And that meat, instead of getting tossed out, that meat might be sold through the local marketplace. And so it was meat that at one point was used for idolatry. But it's sold in the marketplace and out into the world, and guess what? Sometimes people in the temple held parties, and so you've got the church gathering, in a sense, in the temple, and this meat might show up on the table. And so you have some Jesus followers who are looking and saying, it's just meat. Like, we're not sacrificing it to an idol. It's just meat. Put it on the grill. Let's eat. Looks great. You've got others in the room that are saying, wait a minute, not so fast. I don't feel good about this. Like there's a matter of conscience for some of those early followers. Some of them may have themselves been pagan worshipers for a time. They may have been new followers of Jesus, and for them to see this meat sitting on the table, it conjured up imagery, and it brought back all of these things that they were trying to separate from. They were trying to step away from those things. And so they had this question among the church, among the believers. Can a follower of Jesus in good conscience eat the meat that was formerly sacrificed to idols? The answer is yes. But can a follower of Jesus in good conscience refuse to eat this meat that was sacrificed to idols? Yes. So the question is, who's right? And the answer is no one. No one's right. Because no one is wrong. Right? Eating the meat, it actually wasn't commanded, but it also wasn't condemned. It became a disputable issue. It was a non-essential matter. And so the question is not about right and wrong, it's about how you handle it. And so Paul says the one who eats everything must what? The one who eats the meat must what? Convince everybody else at the table to eat the meat? Nope. Must not treat with contempt the one who, for matter of conscience or whatever reason, does not eat it. And the one who doesn't eat it must what? Convince the other person to stop eating it? Nope. Must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Both of them. Both sides of the table. In fact, Paul, later in that same text, in verse 5, he says, man, you need to be convinced in your own mind when it comes to these types of things. This is just one example of a disputable, I'll call it a non-essential matter. Non-essential beliefs, practices, they're very, very important, but they don't have to become divisive because they're not core. They're not core to the nature of the gospel. And just like that early church, we've got to handle thoughtfully a lot of non-essential beliefs. And not only that, whether you know it or not, we actually have to handle a lot of non-essential practices in today's day and age. I could make a long list. Like we could talk about social drinking. We could talk about alcohol. The Bible talks about alcohol and it says, hey, don't be short of drunkenness. Don't drink to that point. But others would say, yeah, so I can socially drink. Others would say, no, we need to abstain completely. Some of us would differ and argue maybe a little bit on the things we watch, certain types of entertainment, certain types of recreation that we think are appropriate or not appropriate for someone who would claim to be a Jesus follower. Listen, even in the church, when it comes to methodologies, there's methodology galore about how we might or might not do church. All of these non-essential things, we have to manage them day after day. Listen, non-essential, it doesn't mean not important. There's very, very important discussions to have around some very important things, but at the end of the day, there's some freedom here. There's some freedom here. God is not condemning or condoning certain things that he doesn't make explicitly clear in Scripture. And so for us, bottom line, we don't need to get so spun up that we get divided. So here's the big picture, right? How should we approach issues of belief? That is such an important question. How should you and I think about the things that we think about? How should we practice the things that we practice? We have to start by understanding this differentiation. There are things that are essential and there are things that are non-essential. Not everything you do, not everything I do has the same weight and the same significance. And I share all that to say this. When we understand that, it helps us navigate the madness of this world that we live in. It helps us better live in an adversarial culture where everything is either right or wrong. And there certainly are things that we need to defend. And there are definitely times to defend them, but there are things that we don't have to get worked up about. And so with all of that in mind and the backdrop, here's what I'm going to do for the remaining time today. I'm going to try to kind of give you a word picture. I'm going to give you an object lesson. I've got some stuff up here today to help process this question right here. How should we think about issues of belief? And what I'm going to do is introduce just a framework. It's a framework, and you're not going to find this in the Bible. I just think this is a helpful framework to give you some categories for how to think about this question. I'm going to call it the 3 buckets of belief. And I actually did this word picture about 2 years ago, so this may look familiar to just a few of you. And this framework I'm going to present, it's not mine. I heard this years ago, but it was memorable and it was impactful, so I want to see if it helps you. So I'm going to tell you about 3 buckets. Here's your first bucket, right here. I'm going to call this your convictions bucket. So what you put in this bucket are your convictions. And when you think about convictions, I want to think the word convinced. The things you put in that bucket are essential. Those are the things that you are absolutely convinced of. These are the things that you would jam into this bucket and you would protect these with your life. Like you build your world around what's in your conviction bucket. You should be very, very committed to those things. And because you're so committed to those things, I'll tell you this, you should probably know the most about these things in your life. From a scholarship standpoint, from a conscience standpoint, you better know why you put it in a conviction bucket. But here's the truth. When it comes to the convictions bucket, we actually have very few of them, very few convictions, but you're going to hold on to them tightly. You're going to hold those tightly. But you have a second bucket as well. The second bucket I'm going to refer to as the persuasions bucket. So you have convictions and you have persuasions. And when you think about the persuasions bucket, I want you to think of the word persuaded. Think of the word persuaded, meaning in your heart and your mind, you've been persuaded. In other words, there are some very good reasons why you may believe something you believe or do something that you do. And you may have come to that conclusion. You may be persuaded because of a certain matter of scholarship, like maybe you've studied some things, you've done some reading, you've looked up stuff, you feel strongly in that way, or again, maybe there's an experience in your life, there's a matter of conscience for you that you hold pretty dearly. It is a persuasion. And I will say we have some of these. We do. We have more persuasions than we do convictions. So there are some of these, but we need to make sure that we're holding all of our persuasions thoughtfully. Thoughtfully. Another way to say that is you need to hold the things in that bucket carefully. Carefully. So here's a third bucket, though. Some of you didn't know you had a third bucket. This is the opinions bucket. The opinions bucket is a big bucket. It's large. Everything that goes in there is just a matter of preference. So think matter of preference. In other words, many things that go in our opinions bucket, they're formed not so much from like a strong scriptural evidence of some kind. It's not always about the hard rights and wrongs. The things that go in the opinions bucket, those are kind of like personality stuff, personal style, just leanings, things that you prefer. They're a preference for you and how you do things, how you see things, how you understand things. And you know what? You're going to have lots of things that go into that opinion bucket. And I would encourage you, hold them loosely. So there's the framework. We've got 3 buckets: convictions, persuasions, opinions. Kind of a simple framework, but here's what it allows us to do. It allows us to look through the lens of these categories and do an inventory. In other words, we can do a quick sorting out of not just the things we believe, but the things we practice. And we can really help determine what is most important in our life to what is maybe least important in our life. And I encourage everybody to do this with their faith. Again, no matter where you are in your faith journey today, it's important to know when it comes to my faith, what is a conviction for me? What is a strong persuasion? And honestly, what is just an opinion? But this framework, if you take it, you'll quickly see you can use it for a lot of things. You could use it as a parent. Like some of you are working through stuff with your kids or working through stuff with your students in your life. And sometimes it's helpful to know when I'm talking with my son or daughter or you're talking with your kids, hey, is this issue that we're about to argue about, debate about, that I'm about to give you discipline for, that I'm about to direct you toward, is it something for me as a parent that is an absolute core conviction in our house? Or is it just something, honestly, that I'm pretty strongly persuaded about? Or if I can be honest, I'm about to get into it with you about something that really for me, it's kind of just my opinion. It's just a preference as a parent. And you can see how that might change the complexion of that conversation. I mean, we do that with our relationships. I'd encourage everybody to do that with relationships. As you think about, you may be in a strong relationship right now and you're starting to argue, or maybe you've had conflict and you can't get past it. You might need to ask each other, listen, is this stuff that we're really fighting about right now, is it core DNA to our relationship? Or is it just us butting heads on ways we see things, ways we do things, just different style of who we are? I mean, you can do it with your finances. You can pick any number of things and kind of use buckets to sort out, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? And where does it belong? Listen, this is the joy of the framework. This is the joy of the framework. It allows us to ask the question we should ask. Have I put everything in the right bucket? You look at these buckets right here. Have I put everything in the correct bucket in my life? The things that I believe, are they in the right category? The things that I do I hold them in the right category? And let's be honest, if we looked enough we might actually all find a few things that we have put in the wrong bucket. From time to time, we can misplace things and we can put them in the wrong bucket. Listen, there are challenges. There are challenges to this in every one of these. And I'll share some of the most common ones with you. I'm going to talk about the convictions bucket for a minute. You know what the most common mistake is with the convictions bucket? We try to put way too many things in it. Sometimes we try to overfill it. We take things from here and we try to pour them into here, and before long, if we're really dedicated, everything, we just jam everything down into this convictions bucket. Everything is core DNA. Have you ever met somebody like that? I bet you have. I bet you have, and you know why? Because they create a lifestyle. They create a whole system that has no gray areas. Everything is black and white. Everything is right or wrong. Everything is a conviction. And you know what? If everything is a conviction, then guess what? Everything is a hill to die on. And if every hill is a hill to die on, then every conversation is a battle. And every conversation becomes combative and adversarial because it's no longer a conversation. It is a competition, one you have to win. That's what happens when everything is a conviction. And some people, in their effort to defend, even to defend God out of the goodness of their heart, they spend so much time defending everyone, they spend all their time offending everybody. You spend so much time defending these things, you offend the people around you. You create tension unnecessarily when you overfill this bucket. And that's the caution. That's the caution with your convictions bucket. Be very careful. Don't overfill it. I'm not saying don't stand up for what you believe. Not saying that. I'm just saying not everything in your life is a conviction, so don't overfill the small green bucket. How about the persuasions bucket? How about this persuasions bucket? What's the challenge? Here's the challenge. It's understanding that while we are strongly persuaded, and this is hard to stomach, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're right. Think of it this way. You may stand behind this bucket of persuasions, and you have very good reason, strong reasons, scholarship, conscience, whatever it is, to believe something about a certain subject. But there's probably somebody standing on the other side of the table with their bucket on the same subject with their strong beliefs and their strong conscience. It doesn't always mean that you're right, but it doesn't always mean that they're right. That's where it leans into conversation. Listen, I learned this in a huge way when I walked into seminary. And I walked into seminary, for those of you who are not familiar, that's a place for theological training, right? And I walked in the doors with a lot of beliefs that I held very firmly. And some of you know that. You would do the same. Like I had certain things that I'd read, certain speakers that I followed. There were certain books that I was absolutely convinced of when I came to my faith, and et cetera, et cetera. And I thought for sure when I walked into the doors of the seminary, they were simply going to cement down everything that I already knew. And I remember being sort of shocked and surprised when I kept meeting professors who were much older than me, much smarter than me, much more mature than me, much more experienced than me, much more accomplished than me, and they would offer up viewpoints, persuasions, that were different than a lot of the things I had known and a lot of things that I had been taught. And I found that there were actually a lot of professors from room to room that may differ with each other in very strong ways around some of these things. I became quickly aware, I guess I didn't know it at the time, that there are lots of theological beliefs and practices where people stand on different sides of the table. And not only that, all these persuasions, they're actually never going to be solved. There are theological debates that are going to go on from now until Jesus returns. And even then, I'm not sure if they're going to get sorted out. Like, that's how complicated some of these things are. In those moments for me, that season of life, it was sort of a forced form of humility. Like that's what seminary was for me. If you want to ask me what I learned in seminary, here's what I learned. I learned that there's so many things that I don't know. There are so many things that I don't know. I learned that there are so many smart people out there with great acts of conscience who are well-intended, who follow Jesus, and who don't all believe the exact same thing. And I learned that that's okay. And I learned that at times we've got to, as Jesus followers, approach people with humility and approach certain subjects with a heart to understand, not just a heart to argue. And we've got to have that heart for understanding, not a heart for argument, especially when it comes to our persuasions. Things that are very important, but we have just at least enough humility to recognize that instead of holding it too tightly, we can hold it just loosely enough to understand who's standing in front of us. All right, it's convictions, persuasions, and then there is a challenge with the opinion bucket as well. Here's the challenge with the opinion bucket. The opinion bucket, we tend to think that our opinions are more strong than they actually are. In other words, we feel more strongly about the things in our opinions bucket than we should. And I think you know what I mean by that. Over time, our opinions start to solidify, and then they drift. And we don't realize we're doing it, but we've actually started to think that all of these are kind of like all of these, that are actually sort of like these. One of the things I realize is maybe you do this, I live a lot of my life around people who reinforce my opinions. Sometimes it's the people in your own house, sometimes it's the people in your world. These are just, again, preferential type things, maybe the way you're wired and certain things around you. But you start to actually collect people around you that believe in the same opinions. We like to be around people that see things the way we see things, that do things the way we do things, and we become comfortable in that. Sometimes we read the same material over and over again, and it just reinforces those same opinions. Sometimes we're on Facebook and we're on social media and we're all these places, and there's actually algorithms that will just keep feeding us the same things that do what? Reinforce over and over the same opinions that we hold. That's real. And over time, if we're not careful and we don't pay attention to it, we start to think our preferences are actually all true and that we're all right. And man, when that happens, tension rises. See, tension really grows when we start to treat our opinions like expectations. And we can take for us, which is a personal preference, and it's just the way we do things, but we can put it on other people and expect them to adhere to it. And we actually do that with people closest to us in our lives. Like we create expectations around us in our sphere. We all do this. We create expectations. We want other people to adopt our opinions, and that's what can happen if we're not careful and we allow those things to feel strongly in our lives when they're really not something to feel that strongly about. We can start to drift. We start to drift, and we need to pay attention. We don't want to frustrate other people in those matters. Listen, every now and then, we all have to ask the hard question. Have I put everything in the correct bucket? Have I put the beliefs that I hold in the right space? The things that I do with my life, have I put them in the right place? Is this the right framework? Is it essential? Is it non-essential? What would God want me to do with the things that I believe and the things that I do? Listen, we live in a mad world. We do. We live in a world of madness. We live in a world where beliefs and ideas, they collide. They collide all the time. You walk outside these doors today, your ideas, your beliefs, they're going to collide with the world around you. And that's why we're starting today. This is just part one, looking closely at this idea of beliefs, because the things we believe, the things we do, the way in which we live out our faith in the world, you know what? God cares a great deal about it. He does. He cares a great deal about it. But when we encounter differences and disagreements show up, when ideas collide, it doesn't always mean we have to walk toward tension. Because in God's landscape, there's things that are essential and there's things that are non-essential. And when we know the difference, we can start to walk toward peace with other people. We can start to bring peace toward other people. And it can be really hard to address that challenge that Paul said at the beginning, right? If it depends on you, and guess what? It often does depend on you. If it depends on us, we can live at peace with other people, even in a chaotic world. But it leans into us having a conviction and understanding about the things that we care about and how we address these situations. God would encourage us, approach our beliefs very thoughtfully. Approach our beliefs thoughtfully. Approach the things you believe and you do carefully. And I think God would even say, approach the things that you believe and the things that you do with some measure of humility. Just enough humility so that you can hold very tightly to the convictions of your faith, but that you might loosen your grip just a little bit more when it comes to persuasions and opinions. And so we no longer have a competition, but we have a conversation with the world around us. And when we do that, we take steps, we take inroads at finding more peace for us, but more than that, we become people who bring peace into the people and into the situation where we live. So join us next week. We're going to pick up part 2. Keep talking about March Madness. Let me pray for us.